So now we're on Chapter 4, Section 4. And we're going to discuss the Civil Rights Movement in this section. Notice a few terms. You need to know the term discrimination means unfair treatment based on prejudice against a certain group. Now, of course, discrimination happens to all kinds of people. African Americans, Jews, it happens to white people, it happens to women, it happens to men, it happens to, people of different religions. Discrimination is any time you treat someone unfairly based on the group they belong to. Now, if I walk into somebody that just happens to be an African American and say, man, you're lazy, but I'm not talking about all African Americans, I'm talking about the one guy, that's not discrimination because of his race. That might be because of how his work ethic or something like that. And that's the way if I go up to a white guy and say, man, you can't read, or man, you don't know what you're talking about, or man, you're stupid, or something like that, which is hateful. Don't bully anybody. I'm not targeting him because of his race, but if I went up to the African American guy and was like, man, your people are all lazy, that's discrimination. I go up to a white guy and I'm like, man, your group is, y'all are all stupid. Then that could be discrimination. It's got to be towards the group. Mistreatment of one person is just bullying or being hateful or something like that. And that's the idea. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws were passed in the South, separating African Americans and whites. And so the idea behind it is with the Jim Crow laws, they wanted to segregate, and you see that down there, social separation of races. They wanted to segregate the whites and the African Americans. Basically, they didn't want them to mix. It sounds insane today, that they looked at it that they were that different. They didn't want them in the same schools, the same restaurants, the same drinking fountains, the same buses. And when they were separated from each other. They weren't allowed to sit next to each other, eat next to each other, talk to each other. It was insane, but it was very much true. Civil rights is the rights of full citizenship and equality under the law. That is the rights of citizens under the law. The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the NAACP was founded in 1909 by African Americans and whites that objected to the mistreatment of African Americans. So it wasn't just African Americans that started the NAACP. And it doesn't just help African Americans, it helps all kinds of people. It's a civil rights group that helps all kinds of people with a number of different issues. Gradually, the NAACP and other groups started the civil rights movement, which gained a victory in 1948 when Harry S. Truman ordered desegregation in the armed forces. Basically, Harry Truman sat there and said,
Tasha Trapp to the office, Tasha Trapp to the office.
Okay. Basically, Harry Truman was like, dude, if these guys can fight together, they should be fighting with each other. If they can fight the same war, they can fight the same enemy, they can fight in the same battalion. And so it gained a big victory when he desegregated the armed forces. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was a rule that segregation was unconstitutional. Now, this was overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed for segregation. It allowed for there to be a white school and a black school under the idea that they were separate but equal. And like I always tell the students, separate but equal is a very wide term. What do you mean by equal? For example, if you give the African American school a few used encyclopedias and you give the white school iPads, that's not equal. Yes, you can look up information in both of them, and that's how they would do it. Or they would give the white school brand new textbooks and give the African American school all the hand-me-down broke textbooks that were outdated. So it wasn't equal, it was just separate. And Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka ruled, you know what, it's not being equal. It's just separated from each other, and we don't need to allow that. It ruled that segregation violated the 14th Amendment's principle of equal protection under the law. It was said African Americans were being treated differently because they were being segregated. They were like pushed off to the side, not allowed to be in the same room as white people a lot of times. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the main leaders of the civil rights movement, and he believed in nonviolent resistance. He had to organize peaceful protests, marches, boycotts, and sit-ins. His idea was, we'll go sit at a counter at a diner, and when they tell us to move and make room for white people, we just won't. Or we'll get on a bus and we'll sit where we want to and we won't move. Or we'll boycott buses altogether and say we're not going to ride the bus. And that was a very productive thing African Americans did, because then a lot of white people also said, we're going to boycott the buses too. And the people started walking to work. And before you know it, the buses are losing a bunch of money, and it makes a big impact. Protests, marches, things like this. This is what Dr. King did. He used these things as a way to promote the cause of civil rights. The Freedom Riders were people that traveled together on buses and protest segregation. They would travel different places and use this opportunity to protest, because the buses were something that had been segregated. And so because of this, the Freedom Riders used that as a tool. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibiting discrimination in public places. It also identified discrimination as not only race, but gender, religion, and national origin. You can't discriminate against anybody for any of these things. So you can't tell someone, I'm not going to rent to you because you're black, or I'm not going to rent to you because you're a Muslim, or I'm not going to rent to you because you're a Christian, or you can't get this job because you're a woman, or you can't get this job because you're white, or you can't, whatever. We're not giving you this loan because of this. You can't discriminate against people. The civil rights movement of the 1960s opened the door for other minorities to make strides in equality. And then you start seeing the LGBT community to really start to push for equality. You're going to see religious groups that are doing it. You're going to see a lot of people start doing it because the civil rights movement was successful. A program that was started also was something called affirmative action, which is a program that tried to make up for discrimination by hiring people in fields previously closed to them. They would hire people in jobs that they normally couldn't get. Like you got to have a certain amount of African Americans in this job, a certain amount of women, a certain amount of men, things like that. And then racial profiling is singling out people because of the way they look. So if you go and after September 11th, if someone that is of Arabic descent or Middle Eastern gets on a plane, they're like, hey, come here, we need to check you, then that can be racial profiling. So instead, they do what's called random testing or random checks, and that allows them to be randomized so that it's not one person that's getting checked or something like that. So that brings us to the end of section 4 in this chapter.